Hello and welcome to The Wrap. Today we are super excited because we have Clara Zeller with us. She has a master's degree in cognitive decision making. Clara is now the global head of DEI at GN. She has several years of experience from management consulting. Now she's moving into the corporate world. So really excited to pick her brain on the DEI topic. Clara, excited to have you on board on The Wrap.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
A definition or a description of the DEI topic. It's been so hot for years now, but I feel that people might lack like an understanding of what DEI actually is and the distinction between diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Diversity refers to sort of the makeup of our workforce. So who is it that is actually represented in our workforce? And we can look at that on a bunch of different dimensions. Most typically, it will be things like age, gender, your romantic preferences, your religion, and so forth, physical, mental abilities, and so forth. Those are the things that we tend to talk about as a starting point when the conversation falls on DEI. And then the second question, and I'm going to go to equity last. The second question is around inclusion. And inclusion sort of broadly refers to the extent to which employees feel that at their workplace, uniqueness is sort of valued. So we appreciate everyone for who they are individually, and we see the uniqueness of everyone in the workplace as bringing value to the workplace. But it also refers to the extent to which employees feel a sense of belonging and feel that there is psychological safety to voice up ideas without fear of retaliation or being ridiculed and so forth. And then equity is an interesting word because it basically refers to the extent to which organizations have policies, structures in place that ensure sort of equal access to outcomes. And it's based on the idea that we need to work with equitable policies to sort of make up for or address historical disadvantages that certain marginalized people have been facing. And it's interesting because if you look back to people's LinkedIn profiles maybe 5 years ago, then people would both refer to DEI as being diversity, equity, and inclusion, and diversity, equality, and inclusion. And the conversation, and I don't know if it's like I don't think that there's been an actual conversation around, do we actually want equality or do we want equity? But for different reasons, now equity is on everyone's radar. And that comes with a few caveats, I think, when we talk about DEI. But we can get into all of that. But that's basically what's in there.
You're coming, as I mentioned initially, you're coming from management consulting as a partner and then moving over to a global head of DEI. Tell us a little bit about why you chose to do that and why this topic is so interesting for you.
So the question around why, I think that can go in many different forms, but I've been a consultant for about 10 years. So you mentioned in the introduction that I have a master's in cognitive and decision sciences. And from a sort of intellectual standpoint, I find it hugely fascinating to understand like what shapes human behavior, how do we change people's behaviors, and also, this inherent gap that all of us know exists between our intentions and our actions. How do we mitigate that in the workplace? So how do we drive organizational initiatives more effectively? I find that to be really, really interesting. And I've had the opportunity to work with that area as a consultant for about 10 years. And for the past 5 years, my focus has mainly been within DEI. So trying to understand, the biases that people hold and that prevent us from creating equitable organizations without us knowing and without poor intent or anything else. But also, what are the actual interventions and initiatives that will drive better representation of minorities in the workplace? How do we measure the impact of, all of the things that we could do to progress DEI in the workplace? How do we know what is most effective and what will actually be most fruitful for us to prioritize? And I think the leap, going from a consultant to actually working in the real world, I think was necessary because there's only so much you can advise organizations around without having actually tried it. I did I was responsible for DEI in my previous workplace, so I did have, that concrete experience coming from it, and also having worked with a bunch of different organizations on DEI. But it is different to think a little bit more long term about, how do we actually progress some of these things.
You mentioned a bit around the DEI initiatives. So how do they manifest in the workspace, and have they evolved over time?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think the best way to understand or talk about how DEI manifests itself in the organization is by referencing, so there are two researchers called Alidina and Frost. They were the first to kind of coin a DEI maturity ladder. And then later on, Deloitte have created like a slightly tweaked version of it. So I'll just use the Deloitte as an example, but it originates elsewhere, full credit. In Deloitte's maturity model, there are kind of 4 phases that organizations can go through when they embark on their DEI journey. The first phase is what we call the compliance stage. So that is typically where, and its center of origin, like where it typically springs out or emerges from, is from a legal office, where, somebody in the legal office realizes that, oh, actually, now we have this size, or now we operate in these markets, so we have a legal obligation to, for instance, do compliance training on DEI, or we need to have DEI statements, or for a certain sustainability certificate, we need to have a policy on DEI. So it kind of emerges from a compliance-related focus, and not really like an intrinsic motivation to be a DEI leader. And then the second phase of that journey that organizations tend to leap forward to fairly quickly is where you enter a more programmatic phase. So now the responsibility or the center of gravity switches from the legal team to the HR team, and the HR team will then kind of work with coming up with different programs. So let's celebrate Women's International Day, or let's do a mentorship program for women, or let's do something in our onboarding where we talk about DEI. But it's a little bit sporadic and not very strategic, if you want to call it that. And it's rarely kind of anchored in the business strategy. Then you get to the third stage, and that's the biggest leap and what you kind of say an inflection point, because that takes quite a lot of effort. And that's where you enter into a leader-led movement or a leader-led phase, where the center of gravity is not really in any one specific department, but it rests with everyone, all leaders, to make sure that, the way that we work with all business processes also have DEI as a component. So when we recruit people, when we promote people, when we design a new workplace flexibility policy, basically in everything we do that impacts our organization, we have a DEI mindset, and we think about bringing in that perspective as well. And then in the last phase, which is Nirvana, I guess I don't know a lot of organizations that have gone there, but that is where it's fully integrated into the business. That will probably be more prevalent for, startups, younger organizations, where maybe also people, the composition of the workforce is younger, because we know that the younger you are, the more you kind of take DEI for granted, where it's just more regular from the offset to have like DEI as part of the way you do business and build out your structures.
Obviously, more difficult for an enterprise or bigger company to take sort of these steps. If you're a scale-up or a startup, do you think you can like move to phase 4 immediately in a way, like just sort of because it's so lean and small? Can you just design for it and be DEI native, if that's a phrase?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that a lot of younger organizations just more naturally, so much has like time has overhauled some of the large corporations in a sense. So the way we think about setting up our systems is more nimble. The technology in place is also becoming increasingly inclusive in a bunch of different ways. So I think that it is, if you're starting from a blank slate, there are a lot of the wrongdoings, you could say, that we've inherited from some of the larger corporations that you can avoid.
Yeah. And with these DEI initiatives, it's been quite a polarized debate, right? It's a bit sort of frowned upon to question the effectiveness, because the majority of people feels obviously that this is the world is moving in the right direction. So, but like critics are often shot down when people are questioning the effectiveness of these programs. So how do you see the debate and the different views in the debate?
Yeah, so I would almost split the question into two. So one question is around understanding the friction that exists around the DEI field, both within the DEI community and the people that practice DEI in organizations, and also maybe critics of DEI initiatives. And then the other part of the question is, at this point, what do we know about what works and what doesn't work? For the first question, in terms of understanding some of the friction, it's really, really interesting at the moment to follow our conversations around DEI and what's happening. From an intellectual point of view, it's super fascinating to see both like some of the ideological movements and ideas that seep through the whole DEI field without us even articulating it. It's just kind of under the surface. Also understanding the globalization of DEI and the contextualization that I don't think we've really made, but there is a very big difference, for instance, between working with DEI in Norway or Denmark or the US or Japan. And I don't think that DEI as a field has matured to tell us, then how do we bridge some of those differences in an elegant way? And then there's the whole thing around, just basic knowledge around, as I was saying before, the terminology is so confusing. And I think that the DEI field has done a poor job of making it an accessible field, which is a little bit ironic, right? But within DEI, one of the things that is happening at the moment, and it's interesting, if you look at the US, that's probably where it's at its height, especially in the academic environment. Several universities have started to shut down some of their DEI offices. They pulled back their mandatory DEI statements, and they're really pulling back on their DEI commitments. And one of the reasons why they're doing that is because there's been a little bit of a confusion between like what is actually the mandate or the purpose of working with DEI in universities. And you could argue that the same kind of confusion is taking place in a lot of organizations. So does the university exist to promote truth-seeking and elaborate on knowledge production, or do universities exist in pursuit of like social justice outcomes, so progressing DEI? That has been an ideological tension, and some would argue, and one of the reasons for organizations and universities pulling back is because DEI has almost become like a purpose on its own, which is not in line with what the universities set out to do. And so I think that the lesson for corporations globally will be to make it very clear, what is the core purpose of my business, and how does DEI, if at all, how does DEI enable that? What within DEI is even relevant for us to be looking at? Because you can't do like a copy paste of it. And then there's the other thing, which is the whole moral debate around equity versus equality. Do we think that we as organizations have an obligation to ensure equal outcomes for everyone? Is that really our responsibility as a business to make up for historical structural disadvantages? Or is it enough that we commit to making sure that we take everyone through the exact same process? So if you go into a recruitment process, it doesn't matter who you are, you're going to get the same treatment like everybody else. Is that what we're aiming for? Or are we aiming to adjust that some people, for historical structural reasons, will need more time, a different set of questions, a different composition of of the recruitment panel? All of these things are really muddy. And that, I think, is in large part actually a moral discussion. And we're mixing it up with, you can either do DEI right or wrong. But I think that there are some decisions that organizations need to make to find out what position do we actually want to take in all of this. But I can go on about this first part of the question in terms of, the backlash that's happening, because it's really fascinating. The other side of the equation in terms of what works within DEI, I think that there are a lot of parallels and similarities to what I've seen within like the behavioral sciences community. So behavioral science was all the rage about like 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and it was basically like the promised land. So all of your biggest problems could be solved with some kind of theory or a bias or behavioral science intervention. And then all of a sudden, this psychological replication crisis started questioning the validity and the replicability of all of these different, you could say, biases and psychological effects that we thought were applicable to everyone around the world. And it really made a lot of people lose faith in the promise of what behavioral science can do in the real world. And the same thing goes for DEI in a sense, because we've been so committed to, DEI as a mission and as something that would make organizations better off, teams better off, individuals better off, stakeholders better off. And now the picture is starting to look a little bit muddy. So we're starting to see that some of the initiatives we thought were actually really impactful are not impactful at all. So like one thing that's really interesting is, for instance, DEI training, unconscious bias training. So that will, like most organizations, when they start on their DEI journeys, they roll out training for everyone. And then they start with like the basic script, which is like, if you have a brain, you're biased. Look at all of the ways in which your brain processes information in a way that makes you stereotype people or makes you discriminate against people that are different from yourself. And this kind of script, what research shows is that this kind of training and this kind of offset to talking about unconscious bias and DEI is actually, in a lot of cases, only reinforcing existing stereotypes. So it's not really doing us any favors. And also, there is no link between having attended a DEI training and what you go out and do in the real world. So you're no more or less, or you're no more or less likely to go and discriminate less after a DEI training. And you also have another thing that doesn't work, which is something called the implicit association test. Well, it's supposedly it measures your implicit preferences and associations to different stereotypes, and it's been used to say, oh, look, you're a racist, or look, you're a misogynist because you prefer men to women, or you prefer a Caucasian-looking face to an African-American-looking face. And that also, that measure has no bearing on what you go out and do in the real world. So whatever that test shows you will not, like, you're not off the hook if the test shows you that you're not biased. You're also not a huge racist if the test shows you that you are, because there isn't really any correlation between the test and the real world. But we still use it. Organizations still use it. And then in terms of interventions, like one of the worst things that you can do is to go and do like a women's leadership program. But still, like, I can tell you the first 10 organizations that do just that. And you're not helping women that way. You're actually wasting their time and their money, or the organization's money at least. But this is just like, the thing is, like, science is a moving target. And so is our knowledge about what works and what doesn't work. What I think we can learn from this and what we can take away from it is that we need to, because context matters so much in terms of what works and what doesn't work, we need to measure and we need to find out, what is it that we would like to achieve, and how are the initiatives that we're rolling out actually helping us or preventing us from reaching those targets. And the thing is, with a lot of people initiatives, like, organizations are so bad at measuring the impact of their people initiatives. I have not seen one elegant way of measuring the impact of a leadership program or of a training. People, they just roll out, and I know this because I've been a consultant working with it. People will roll out trainings to find out, like surveys to find out, was it enjoyable? Well, okay, so you had like 5 good days, or it was a really engaging speaker. That will not tell you anything about whether or not women are more or less likely to get promoted next year, or whether or not we are getting better at recruiting ethnic minorities. So it's really, I think some of it is also within the whole people field that we're just very bad at measuring what works within kind of HR.
Why do you think that is? Is it because, like, it's social science and difficult to sort of connect input with output, or why do you think people or companies are so bad at it?
Yeah, that's one thing. I think so. Of course, human systems are complex. So you could argue, like, if we were to roll out, like, let's say we do, like, we have our performance review coming up, and we do a talent review and succession planning process. And we've noticed that women are not as represented in the top performing category, like our top talent category, as we would like them to be. And we have a hypothesis that one of the reasons is that few of them are actually even interested in pursuing leadership, that we have a motivation that they don't want it. They want to prioritize other things. Well, then one suggestion for an intervention could be, well, what if we change the types of conversations we have with women about what leadership entails? What if they need more time to process a decision around whether they want to pursue leadership? What if they want to have a flexibility in the way that they pursue that leadership role, so they can still do one thing and still do another thing? These are essentially 3 different hypotheses that we could test out in our organization. So we could roll out one intervention where we tweak the conversations that we have with potential female leader candidates. We could also make sure that we spend more time having the conversation to clarify together with the women in terms of whether they want to pursue these leadership positions or not. And we could also look at what a flexible option would be, where you allocate parts of your time to doing leadership, parts of your time to doing some other thing. These are 3 different interventions, but in a lot of people initiatives, we just assume we have the answer and then we go and roll it out. Like, we're not even curious. We're not like, we don't have that scientific curiosity, that passion in terms of understanding what will actually change things here. And that's also because that when, like, if you just look at the basic setup of organizations, like HR is kind of, we want a budget, we're going to spend the money on the budget. And by the end of the year, we want to be able to say we rolled out training to 500 women, and then we can kind of tick the box. But we're not really held accountable to saying, did we actually change the willingness in some of those women to wanting, like, are more women telling us that they want to stay and that they are inspired and motivated to pursue a leadership role? That should be what defines and determines what our budget is going to look like next year.
Agree. Now, this is so fascinating. And I wouldn't say controversial, but it's science based, and that's something I would advocate and focus on. I think definitely what you're bringing up here is something I've also seen, that there is a lot of spend in this field, because it's natural that companies want to focus on it for, like, I don't know, morale or for employer brand, or motivation can be very, very different from company to company. But it seems to be very, like, we have this on the agenda, we create this roadmap of DEI activities, but holding people or initiatives accountable for, like, the outcome and not just the output is not that what I've seen so far. Whereas other departments might be much more, because of maturity in a way, other departments are more held accountable for results and ROI, while this area is underdeveloped, it seems. They're really, really good insights. And we've talked a bit about these initiatives and what doesn't work. So from your perspective and from the science you've viewed, what would you focus on? Depends on what your target is, of course, but more on the general stuff that companies want to do. They want to hire more diverse. They want to like maybe build a more work-life balance culture and keep, I don't know, parents, single people, every type of like life situation happy and retained in the company. So what have you seen of initiatives that has the right effect for the business?
So I think a starting point is to synchronize your top management, and don't take it lightly. Executive leadership teams are incredibly busy, and you're lucky if you get to spend 1.5 hours with them. If they are serious about doing DEI work, it is a very good investment of their time to spend a lot of time together. And by a lot of time, I say maybe spend a day together to align on what DEI is, what the organization's viewpoint on DEI should be, and also what is it exactly within DEI that enables our business purpose, and that is a vehicle for whatever strategic initiatives and targets we've set in motion. I think making that connection is going to be super important and also super helpful for the rest of the organization. I don't think anybody is expecting organizations to say that they have initiatives for every imaginable DEI parameter in the world. But I think that there are 2 things that you can do, which is on the one hand, commit to anti-discrimination. So we want to make sure that there are not any of our people processes that are discriminating, any marginalized groups of people. And then on the other hand, what are going to be those initiatives that will set you apart from your competitors, and also that makes sense from a business setting? And to give you an example from GM, we produce hearing aids and different gaming and enterprise solutions for the hybrid workplace, or gaming as a consumer-centric as a division. But we basically work with communication and with bringing people closer. That's what our purpose is. And And then we've recently launched our leadership commitments, and one of them has a very big focus around customer centricity. And we haven't really done anything around accessibility, which is interesting because we work with hearing impairment, and we work with bringing people close in. We work with, making the hybrid workplace a more equitable experience for everyone. That is a place where there's a perfect kind of meeting between our DEI focus and efforts, between our leadership commitments and our culture, and the culture we think that will enable our strategic purpose, and then our business, which is covering some of these products that I just mentioned. So that would be, that is an obvious area for us to really focus a lot of our energy and attention, which I also think we will and are in the process of doing. And I think that exercise would be interesting for all organizations to have. What is it that our mandate is, and where do we have room to play? That was just synchronizing top management. Then there's also something about having leaders onboarded, preferably with mandatory leadership training. So we just know that raising everyone's awareness around what inclusive leadership entails is really helpful. Then having a DEI person or office in place has also been proven to be effective. So having accountability and knowing also from employee side, knowing that there is somebody that kind of has that hat on is super impactful. And then workplace flexibility that goes without saying, but it just is an initiative that kind of benefits everyone. So those are some of the things that we know that work. And then I think, as I said before, experimentation. And if you're not a huge organization, if you don't have the privilege to roll out, large randomized controlled trials, then make sure you at least have regular data, and don't ask your employees one DI question twice a year. Get more granular data, and preferably data that's linked to, who are the people coming in the door? Who are the people that we manage to keep? Who are the people we promote? What does it take for us to make them thrive? So be really focused on that whole employee funnel from a DEI perspective.
Looking at that recruitment process and understanding the pipeline or the funnel of candidates that you have is a big focus to ensure you have representation across different areas of diversity. But within the recruitment process itself, do you think there are measures companies can take within like the interview process or test assessments, anything there that you would advise companies to do to improve?
Yeah, I think there are many good resources. So Be Applied, I just want to advertise to them. Be Applied, it's a website you can go to. It's also an organization. They have a wealth of resources on like what are best practices for debiasing your recruitment process, and you can find a million of those. Some that come to mind are: make sure you have a diverse hiring panel. So whoever you bring into the door, make sure that they get to meet a wide variety of colleagues, and not just the normal people that we would introduce them to, because it tends to be quite a narrow interviewer field. That's one thing. The other thing is making sure that the process and the things that we ask candidates about is similar for all. So if you do have different interviewers, make sure that they have been trained in how to do the interview, and make sure that the candidates have a uniform interviewing experience or recruitment experience. And then also measure on that recruitment experience, and measure not just on what is the candidate's satisfaction, but also measure from a compliance perspective. Did the candidate experience this? Did they have the number of interviews they were supposed to have? Were they asked some of these questions? And you can do that in an audit format, but just to really find out and be committed to ensuring a uniform process for everyone. And then there are things like very basic things, but when you meet somebody, it's hold space for them to share what they want to share. Don't assume that they're gonna, talk about their family life or whatever personal things that they may wanna hold off with sharing until they feel comfortable sharing it. So leave space for the candidate to share what aspects of their identity that they're comfortable sharing. And then be very transparent about the process. I think managing expectations around this is where we are in the process, this is what's to come, this is when you can expect to hear from us. All of these things are like very basic best practices, but they don't happen in a lot of organizations. I think, a lot of candidates have very poor recruiting experiences. And then the final thing you can do, which is based on a scientific study, is that if you have a minority candidate that didn't make the cut, but they were like pretty close to making the cut, and you could maybe foresee that they would be a relevant candidate 6 months from now, 1 year from now, 2 years from now, give them that feedback and tell them what they would need to work on for them to be eligible or maybe relevant at a later stage. And then you put that name on a list and you make sure to call them back and you find out and you check on how they do. So think about your talent pipeline as being more than just the number of people that apply for a specific role. Think about, a whole network of people that you can reach out to. And think about talent development is not just happening within the confines of your organization, but also think about more broadly, what is the talent that you would like to build for the future? One last thing I wanted to share, and that was just because I mentioned there are two things in terms of, where in the recruitment process or like where in our people processes do we see discrimination. I think one other thing that's very salient in a lot of organizations is that our idea around who is a good leader is extremely narrow, and it's narrow to the point where it's like this classical masculine traits hardballer type. Not to say that it is a man, because there are also women that display these traits, but they are the people that we tend to promote and kind of associate with being very strong leaders. And it's such a shame because everyone loses out on that, because if you are a man and you don't necessarily see yourself as being like that assertive hardballer who just knows what direction we're going and is making tough cuts, then you're not going to pursue a leadership role in that organization. And if you are a woman and you cannot identify with some of those other women that are even, more fierce and more tough than some of their male counterparts, then they're also going to leave. So I think that there is an opportunity for a lot of organizations to broaden their horizon in terms of what is a good leader in our organization, who are the role models that we honor and that we celebrate, and how do we hold space for diverse leaders who hold different values and are not all kind of that, very confined stereotype, I would say.
What's also typically stated in the debate is that diversity brings more creativity, more innovation, financial outcomes. That's something you've mentioned. But what about these are non-business related results of diversity? Is creativity and innovation? What's your views on the science backing that's giving better results for the company?
I think the sign at large is pretty much in favor of that argument. And the best resource to go to for that is some of the publications done by Adler. I think it's from 2019, basically showing across a wide range of contexts that diverse teams in inclusive cultures outperform homogeneous ones. Also, in terms of creativity and innovation.
Yeah. And if you're a company, because you mentioned that in open and diverse cultures, then diversity has an effect. But if you're not by default an open culture, then it might have a counterproductive effect. So if you want to become more diverse, open, focus on DEI, but your benchmarking where you're coming from is not that type of culture, you want to move in that direction. On that journey, I assume you will have negative effect because you need to sort of break through a point in time in the involvement of that journey that will be difficult for the organization to adapt and to really embrace and to be productive in, a 2.0 of the company culture in a way.
Yeah, you should almost have like an organizational readiness assessment for when you can start the conversation. I know a lot of people that have been premature in raising the DEI agenda in their organizations and that have left for the same reason. I think definitely the world around us is moving, and that has also shaped a lot of business leaders and I guess just the total workforce and their openness to DEI initiatives. But there's also something around the tonality that you bring into it. And I think that there is I was talking a little bit before about this moral divide that sometimes happen when we talk about equality versus equity. And I think that if you're born and raised with the mindset that there are equal opportunities for all and that nobody's holding anyone back, then it's a very large pill to swallow to be told that actually there are historical inequities and you're part of the reasons for it and you have a responsibility to fix it, because then you're kind of getting up on this moral high ground. And if there's anything that we know does not work for driving any form of change, then it is kind of moral finger pointing. And so I think that there's something around bringing in data, looking at it together and not pointing fingers, and then finding out, like, it looks like we may have an issue here. What data would make us either change our minds about whether we have a problem or not, and also what data would help us shed light on, what is the root cause of the problem and what initiatives might help mitigate some of these issues. But you need to invite each other in. And I think that's also where, if you practice DEI, the thing is, a lot of people that work with DEI do it out of it's almost a personal mission. And quite often people that practice DEI identify with some sort of marginalized group. And when you do that, then you have a lot of identity at stake. And the minute you have your own identity at stake in driving the work, then you are not just a DEI practitioner, you're also an activist. And when you are an activist, then you have a very clear idea around where you want to go and kind of what needs to happen. You also have an idea around who are you being an activist against, or who is it that you're kind of trying to convince. And I think that impactful DEI work takes almost like neutral activism, where you need to remove yourself from the equation a little bit in pursuit of a greater mission. But you need to be able to get even your counterparts to feel welcome and invited as part of the conversation. Some of the best conversations I have had have been with leaders that have been very passionate about DEI, but in a completely different direction than me. And I've actually learned quite a lot from those conversations. And I think it's made me appreciate to a larger extent that the world is not as black and white as I sometimes have seen it to be.
And do you think that's a bit of the problem with the debate, that people advocating this has an own interest in it, or coming from a more subjective rather than objective and science-based approach?
Yeah, but I don't know if I believe so much in an objective world. I guess everything is filtered by, our experiences and how we see them. But I think the DEI community is a little bit of an echo chamber. The webinars you look at, the events you go to, the authors that you read, all of it is marinated in one way or the other in critical race theory. And in that world, then everything can be seen in the lens of an oppressor and somebody being oppressed. And that is a very black and white world of viewing, like black and white light of viewing the world in. And so I think that, I would just encourage everyone to really make friends with some of the most critical DEI colleagues that you have, and then really understand where they're coming from and be genuinely curious, because you will definitely learn something in the process.
You mentioned something about like having a moral approach to this, or finger pointing, and that's not like yielding the results. We had a very low hanging DEI initiative, and I'm not sure if I support it in a way. Like this is, I'll share the example on Slack when a person is using gender specific language. Like for example, hey guys, how are you doing? Then like an automation pops up, guys is a word that's not like it's male dominant in a way, or masculine. And then the reaction from the organization was like, okay, we don't need this policing. It's not supporting the cause. Like this is not the right way of doing it. So what's your take on these sort of small, corrections that you can implement in an organization?
Yeah. Can you say a little bit more about what your own reaction to it was?
Good question. Maybe I felt, policed in a way, because that's been natural language. Hey guys, hey team, hey, like I didn't think about it like that, but I understand like in hindsight that, okay, it's a masculine and maybe excluding other type of word. and then maybe I like, that was not my intention. Like the software is the issue. So, I don't know. It made me, at least it brought awareness, on my end. And like, I wasn't, well, you put me on the spot there, Clara. It's easier to ask the questions rather than
No,
giving
but
the
I,
answer. No, but sorry. I felt I felt it was good the first time, but then suddenly we had this sort of policing across the whole organization.
yeah,
Anyone wrote anything, like, it feels like you had this grandpa that was sitting in the Slack channel, and that sort of made it
exactly.
uncomfortable in a way.
Yeah, of course. And I think that's just it, right? That when we want to drive change, we need people with us. And the only way we're going to get people with us is if we speak to them in a way that they would like to be speak to. You know, you can also talk about creating a positive recipient status. This sounds really weird, but from a communication perspective, I mean, don't belittle people. Don't assume that they don't, know how to speak and engage with others in the workplace, and find out when are the right opportunities to address some of these things. There's a big difference between writing, "Hey guys," in the chat, and then, obviously discriminating somebody in a meeting, or and you can pull people aside and you can talk to them. And there are also ways of addressing and calling out bias in the workplace. You hear a joke about a sexual minority, you should address it. But you need to pick your battles a little bit. And I think one thing that is something I also feel quite critical about within DEI is exactly what you're getting at, is this policing of language and what other people can say, and not thinking that we all have good intentions. Also, because I'm sorry to say it, the world is a brutal place. You're going to hear people saying things about you and about others that suck and that are awful. But you also have to, you're not going to be broken by that. And obviously we have a collective responsibility to change the narrative and to speak more inclusively. But if it gets to a point, like the other day I was on LinkedIn, I saw somebody who made a post. It was a DI practitioner who made a post about whether or not we should improve does blind hiring actually work? And then somebody in the chat, a police woman, somebody in the chat wrote, sorry, blind hiring, I think, are we not being a little bit ableist here? And so then you have to learn a new language. And eventually we're changing the whole narrative around, like, our language changes. And what we know is that language is power. And this is where there's a really fascinating book coming out in October by a professor at Columbia called Musa Al-Gabi. And he's written a book called "We Have Never Been Woke." And the book is basically arguing that DI practitioners has become this new social elite called symbolic capitalist, where we are increasingly owning the language and the terminology in the workplace to gain influence ourselves, which I think is such an interesting theory, because that is exactly what happens when we want to decide and police, what you say and how you greet other people. And so I think actually that pushback is really healthy. And I think that a lot of us have been so afraid to say the wrong thing, so we've kept quiet. But that just gains, then the DI ideology just gains even more traction, and that kind of amplifies the echo chamber. So I think having that healthy conversation around, I see your point, and I see that it's a gendered language, but it's also just very prevalent. Yeah, I think we just have to assume that we all have good intentions. We're going to say stuff all the time that's going to come out wrong, and we have to rely on others to help us correct it. But we're not gonna have to rely on others to police us, because that's worthwhile. And also, we have to pick our battles with what language we find acceptable and what language we, absolutely must change.
It brings me to maybe a bigger question, but you were tapping into like the woke movement in a way, and we see Gen Zs with different perspective coming into the workspace. So how do you sort of see the future of DEI, the future of company culture? Will we see more polarization between the woke and the other wing in a way, or how do you see this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think in general, like, younger generations are more globalized in a lot of ways, and also when you look at ethnic and racial minorities, like people are becoming more diverse. Like we are kind of, love has many shapes and forms. And so the idea of having like societies that are extremely homogenous, I think will become less prevalent over time. So I think it will become more natural. I also think that there are a lot of tendencies in society right now that invoke polarization, and that there's a lot of awareness around also the contribution of social media and so forth and driving that hopefully we'll get to change and have a more critical perspective on. In terms of organizations, I guess I'm not sure. I guess I could see both scenarios being the case, but it's a little bit like a pendulum, right? Swinging from one side to the other. For a long time, we haven't really done anything, and now the pendulum has really swung far left, being very pro woke. And now there's like a big backlash movement. I don't think that the answer is to shut down all of your DI initiatives and to say, there are equal opportunities for all, so let's not do more. But I think it needs to find its balance in some way.
Good. And it's very easy to simplify the discussion in a way and talk about the polarized or discussion the majority will understand that this is complex. But I appreciate your straight shooting in a way. It seems like you're coming at it from a more scientific point of view, which I think is not that common, unfortunately, in these type of discussions. If you're leading DEI in a company and listening to this episode, what are your concrete advice in terms of implementing these DEI initiatives? You mentioned it a bit about like where would you focus the phases, but more on the implementation, more like getting people on board with this. You mentioned especially on the executive team commitment and getting them aligned. That's one part. But what about the rest of the organization? How do you get everybody on board with this?
So I think start with data, find out what has been done in the organization, what has worked, what has not worked, be super curious, and get people to generate hypotheses with you. So why does it look like this? Why does it not look like that? What would it need to, what data would convince us that it could look like that instead? So invite everybody into your way of thinking curiously about what's up and down with DEI in our organization. Don't come in with too many assumptions, or at least invite other assumptions into the pool as well. And then I think just manage expectations. I said before, make sure that you synchronize your leadership team, but also manage expectations with them. How much time do they actually think they're going to be spending on this per year? What kind of initiatives and with what bandwidth will you and others be involved in driving some of those initiatives? Get your leadership teams help with prioritizing. Don't just, make it a free for all. Everyone can do DEI, but drive a few good initiatives and make progress in those, and then expand it from there. Then I think, as I said before, make sure that you have representation within your DEI efforts. So that both goes across cultures. So if you work across cultures, make sure that you get the voice of not just your headquarters, but kind of wherever you do business. Also make sure that you have viewpoint diversity in the way that you drive your DEI efforts. So don't just get the true believers. Also make sure you get the quiet ones and maybe the critical ones, to sense make with them around, what would be initiatives that work for everyone. The thing is, with a lot of whenever we talk equity, it resonates a little bit with affirmative action. The thing is, if you kind of are pro-equity, then you tend to think that the equitable initiatives and organizations are not doing enough. And if you underestimate the impact that they actually have, and if you are anti-affirmative action or anti-equity, then you have a hypothesis that the initiatives are actually doing way more than they should be doing. They're they're disproportionately favoring certain people in the workplace relative to others. So make sure that you're very clear about whatever initiatives you have, like what exactly do they do and how are they benefiting, maybe not just specific groups of individuals in the workplace, but how are they benefiting more people? So just make sure that you're communicate very clearly about the initiatives that you do. A lot of organizations also have these advisory boards that can be a combination of if you're a larger organization, you tend to have these ERGs or employee resource groups. Invite them in, listen to what they have to say and get their perspectives, not just on their specific ERG, but also get them to take a responsibility for shaping, like, across all ERGs, with the time that we have, with the capacity and the resources we have, how can we make progress the year to come, but bring their perspectives in and give them influence over how you allocate your time and resources. And then I think as a last stage, focus on what it is that you have in common. And this goes for organizations, but also I think in society, and we look at, you asked before around polarization. We've become so individualized to the point where we've forgotten, like, what are we here for together? And I think that, it's not a battlefield. Like in a lot of organizations, like I can say for GN, we are there to bring people closer. We are there to create really cool technology to make people have great hybrid meetings and speak to their loved ones and game with their friends. Like, that is what we're there to do. And we are in pursuit of that mission together. So how can we succeed together and not focus on what do you two need and what does Clara want, but really, really establish what it is that unites us. I think that conversation is, sometimes we take it for granted, but I think it's needed more than ever.
Yeah. Plus one on everything you said, and especially on that common mission, because especially now with the world changing, new generations coming into the workspace, it's been very individualistic focus. And I think that's creating more unproductive cultures, because you can't cater to every specific need an individual. You need to compromise in a way. And I think that's our common vision, is that North Star metric or target for organizations. And I think that's a really good point. We talked a bit about different initiatives and testing and using data. So if I were a CFO or a CEO and you came in as head of global DEI, would you then also advocate for portioning investment and doing it more sequentially to test and then expand to see what sticks and what's working, rather than going like spending a lot of cash because you don't know what's giving the best results? So portioning it out, is that the best investment approach to this, or what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I would love that. Like, from my side, I would love that, and this is not where we are right now, so I can just dream, but I would love that, my CEO said, listen, I can just say women in leadership, we don't have enough of them. We want to move the needle on women in leadership. I'm going to give you, let's just say, X amount of money to do a proper diagnostic, to come up with your best answers for why that is not the case now. And then we're going to open up a new budget later on, when we then find out what initiatives will actually move the needle on it. And we can work with experiments. They're going to be low-hanging fruits that we can probably implement for all, but then there are probably going to be initiatives that maybe we need to treat as pilots, or we need to test them out in a smaller scale before we roll it out to everyone. And then, absolutely, I would be completely fine with that. And then make my bonus dependent on whether or not I actually managed to move the needle on some of those outcome measures, and not, just did I roll out training for, I don't know. And the worst case is not actually, people don't get measured on how many people they give the training to. They get measured on how many trainings they ran, not thinking about the fact that, only 5% enrolled and 2% completed it. So, and it's such a waste of everyone's time. It's really ridiculous.
I think a great closing point, like fix the disconnect with the business metrics and the outcome. That's something that's really, really needed. So Clara, thank you so much for sitting down with me for an hour and discussing a really interesting topic, and really, really excited to launch this episode. I think there will be a lot of people that are super interested in listening to your thoughts here.
Cool. So I really appreciate you taking the time. It was great talking to you, and say hi to everyone in the office from me, and enjoy the summer.
Thank you for listening. Remember to like and subscribe. We're coming out with a new episode every single month.